August 23, 1945, Okinawa, Japan. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hastily constructed internment camp as 23 Japanese women lined up for their daily meal, their eyes fixed on the ground beneath their feet. War had stripped away their homes, their status, and now their certainty about the world. They believed they were about to witness the barbarism that imperial propaganda had promised would follow American victory. What they could not possibly anticipate was how a chance encounter with soldiers they had never been meant to see would shatter everything they had been taught to believe about their enemies, their empire, and themselves. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how a segregated unit of African-American soldiers and a group of Japanese female prisoners of war created an unexpected cultural exchange that would challenge deep-rooted prejudices on both sides, revealing how shared humanity can emerge in the unlikeliest corners of a global conflict. Lieutenant Akiko Nakamura checked her reflection in the cracked mirror of the women's barracks. Despite 3 weeks in American captivity, she still maintained what dignity she could. Her Imperial Japanese Navy nurse uniform, once pristine, now hung loosely on her frame after weeks of inadequate rations during the final desperate defense of Okinawa. She straightened her posture, reminding herself of her responsibilities to the other 22 women under her care. Most were nurses like herself, with a few civilian administrators who had been trapped when American forces surrounded their hospital compound in the final days of the battle. "Remember your training," she addressed the women, her voice steady despite the fear churning inside her. "Do not make eye contact. Do not accept any special favors. If questioned, provide only your name, rank, and service number." Midwife Yuki Tanaka, the oldest at 43, nodded grimly. "They're changing the guard rotation today. I overheard the translator. Some new unit is taking over the camp." Nurse Sadako Ito, barely 20 and the youngest of their group, looked up with poorly concealed terror. "What kind of unit? The Marines who captured us were—" She trailed off, unable to finish. Akiko understood her fear. The Marines had been rough in their capture, shouting incomprehensible orders, shoving them into trucks. But contrary to the imperial propaganda they'd all absorbed for years, there had been no atrocities, no violations of their persons. The confusion left them in a constant state of anticipation, waiting for the barbarism they'd been promised would come. "It doesn't matter what unit," Akiko said firmly. "Our duty remains the same. Conduct ourselves with honor. Reveal nothing. Survive." The women filed out of the barracks for the morning meal, walking in precise formation as they had since their capture. The August heat was already oppressive, promising another day of sweltering temperatures. The camp itself was relatively small, just a collection of tents and hastily constructed wooden buildings, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. They were separate from the main prisoner compounds that held thousands of Japanese soldiers. As they approached the mess area, Akiko noticed the difference immediately. The usual white American guards were gone. Instead, standing at attention along the perimeter were soldiers in American uniforms, but with skin darker than any human beings she or any of the women had ever seen before. Sadako gasped audibly. Yuki stumbled mid-step. Even Akiko, despite her determination to maintain composure, felt her heart rate quicken. "Eyes down," she hissed to the others who had begun to openly stare. Staff Sergeant Marcus Washington of the 96th Engineer Battalion, 593rd Engineer Service Regiment, had been on Okinawa for just 36 hours, and already he felt the weight of being simultaneously invisible and conspicuous. His all-black unit had spent most of the war building roads, airfields, and infrastructure far from the front lines, essential work that received virtually no recognition. When orders came to relieve the Marine unit guarding a small women's POW camp, the men had mixed feelings. Guard duty wasn't what they'd trained for, but after months of backbreaking construction work in the Philippines, many welcomed the change. "Remember the briefing," First Lieutenant Robert Jackson reminded the men as they took up their positions that morning. "These prisoners are military personnel, not civilians. They've been fed propaganda about Americans for years. Maintain discipline at all times." Marcus nodded, adjusting his helmet. At 26, he'd been a mathematics teacher in Detroit before the war. 2 years of military service had hardened his body, but not his thoughtful nature. He joined up believing that proving African-American patriotism and courage might finally lead to changes back home. That hope had dimmed as he witnessed the segregation within the military itself. Separate units, separate facilities, separate rules. "Sergeant Washington," Lieutenant Jackson called. "You speak some Japanese, right? From that course at Camp Shelby?" "Just a few phrases, sir," Marcus answered. "Nothing conversational." "Good enough. You'll assist the regular translator when needed. Stay sharp. The prisoners are approaching for morning mess." Marcus took his position and watched as the Japanese women entered the area in formation. He noticed their uniform-like clothing, their disciplined movements, and most of all, their reaction when they saw the black soldiers. Their attempts to hide their shock were unsuccessful. "They act like they've never seen a Negro before," Private James Cooper muttered beside him. "They probably haven't," Marcus replied quietly. "Japan didn't have many foreigners before the war, from what I've heard. Certainly not many colored folks." The women formed a line at the serving table, keeping their eyes down as a white sergeant from the camp administration team and a Nisei interpreter explained the procedure. But despite their efforts at discipline, Marcus could see them stealing glances at him and the other black soldiers. One woman, who appeared to be their leader, maintained perfect composure, back straight, eyes forward, movements precise. But even she couldn't entirely hide her curiosity, her gaze flickering over the black guards before snapping back to attention. At the serving table, Private First Class William Duke Ellington, a former jazz musician from Chicago, handed out trays of food. When the first Japanese woman reached him, she seemed momentarily paralyzed, staring at his hands as he offered her the tray. "Go on, take it," Duke said with a smile, forgetting she couldn't understand him. "Food's not great, but it's not terrible either." The woman hesitated, then cautiously accepted the tray, careful not to let their fingers touch. As she moved along, Duke shook his head with a rueful smile at Marcus. "Can't win for losing, Sarge. Back home, white folks don't want us in their restaurants. Over here. The enemy's afraid to take food from our hands." "Just keep the line moving," Marcus replied professionally, though he felt the familiar sting of recognition. "They've got to eat, whatever they think of us." Lieutenant Jackson approached, lowering his voice. "Washington Cooper, there's a meeting at 1400 hours. Colonel's coming to inspect the camp. Everything needs to be by the book." "Yes, sir," they responded in unison. As the officers moved away, Marcus noticed the leader of the Japanese women watching the interaction carefully. Though her expression remained neutral, he sensed she was observing every detail, assessing the dynamics among the American soldiers. Their eyes met briefly before she looked away. For a fleeting moment, Marcus recognized something in her gaze beyond the shock or disgust he might have expected. There was calculation, intelligence, and perhaps a flicker of confusion. Sergeant Hiroshi Yamamoto, the Nisei interpreter assigned to the camp, approached Marcus as the women finished collecting their food and moved to the designated eating area. "Sergeant Washington, Lieutenant Jackson says you know some Japanese." "Very little," Marcus admitted. "Just what they taught us in basic intelligence training." Yamamoto nodded. "Better than nothing. The regular interpreter is sick today, and I can't be everywhere at once. The lieutenant wants one of us to observe the prisoners during meals, see if they say anything useful." Marcus hesitated. "Is that appropriate?" "Sir, they're women." Yamamoto's expression softened slightly. "They're also military personnel, Sergeant. Most are nurses who've been treating Japanese soldiers trying to kill our boys. The lieutenant just wants to know if they discuss anything of intelligence value." He paused. "But between us, they mostly talk about food, home, and wondering when the war will officially end." Marcus nodded. "I understand, sir. Good. I'll take the first shift. You'll relieve me halfway through their meal. Just stand near enough to listen. Act like you're just doing regular guard duty." As Yamamoto walked away, Marcus found himself studying the women more carefully. They sat together on benches, eating with careful, measured movements. Despite their circumstances, prisoners in a foreign land, surrounded by enemy soldiers who looked unlike anyone they'd ever seen, They maintained remarkable composure, all except the youngest one, who couldn't have been more than 20. She kept stealing glances at the black soldiers, her expression a mix of fear and undisguised curiosity. Akiko noticed Sadako's wandering eyes and nudged her sharply. "Stop staring," she whispered in Japanese. "It's disrespectful." "But Lieutenant," Sadako whispered back, "I've never seen anyone with skin that color. How can they be Americans? The Americans are supposed to be white demons." "They are still enemies," Akiko replied firmly. "And you're making us look undisciplined," Yuki leaned in. "The propaganda never mentioned black Americans. I saw some pictures once, in a foreign magazine before it was banned. But seeing them in person—" She trailed off, shaking her head slightly. "It doesn't matter what they look like," Akiko insisted, though she too found her gaze drawn to the dark-skinned soldiers. Their presence confused the careful categories she'd constructed in her mind: Japanese and American, civilized and barbaric, us and them. "Remember your training." Midway through the meal, Akiko noticed the exchange between the Japanese-American interpreter and one of the black soldiers, the tall one with thoughtful eyes, who seemed to be of some rank. After their conversation, the interpreter moved away and the black soldier took up a position near enough to potentially overhear their conversation. "English only," Akiko said immediately, switching languages. Her own English was functional but heavily accented, learned during nursing training when some medical texts were only available in English. "Weather very hot today." The other women followed her lead, shifting to broken English phrases about the weather and the food. Akiko noticed the black soldier's expression change slightly, a raised eyebrow, a hint of amusement. He knew exactly what they were doing. For 3 days the pattern continued. The black soldiers maintained the camp perimeter, distributed meals, and supervised work details. The Japanese women maintained their discipline, though their initial shock at seeing African Americans began to give way to curiosity. On the 4th day, as the women tended the small vegetable garden they'd been permitted to plant behind their barracks, Sadako dropped her trowel, and it slid under the barbed wire marking the camp boundary. Without thinking, she reached toward it, only to freeze when a shadow fell across her. Looking up, she found herself staring at the tall black soldier, Sergeant Washington she'd heard him called. Sadako shrank back, her heart pounding. The soldier held up his hands in a calming gesture, then slowly knelt and retrieved the trowel. Instead of simply handing it to her, he placed it on the ground and stepped back, giving her space to collect it herself. "Thank you," she said hesitantly in English. The soldier nodded. "You're welcome," he replied, then added, "Ki o tsukete." Be careful. Sadako's eyes widened at the Japanese phrase. Before she could respond, Akiko called her back to work, her tone sharp with warning. That evening in the barracks, the women whispered among themselves. "He spoke Japanese," Sadako reported, still sounding amazed. "Barely," Akiko corrected. "One phrase doesn't mean he speaks the language." "But he tried," Nurse Fumiko Sato pointed out. "None of the white soldiers ever tried to speak Japanese to us." Akiko frowned. "What does it matter? They're still our captors." "I'm just saying it's interesting," Fumiko persisted. "We were told Americans were uncultured barbarians who would rather die than learn a superior language like Japanese. But this one made the effort." "Perhaps it's a trick," Yuki suggested, "to get us to lower our guard." Akiko nodded. "Exactly. Remember, the Imperial General Headquarters warned us that Americans would use any means to extract information, even pretending to respect our culture." But as she lay on her narrow cot that night, Akiko found herself troubled by doubts. The black soldiers' behavior didn't match what she'd been told to expect from Americans. They were disciplined, professional, and so far had shown no sign of the barbaric treatment she'd steeled herself to endure. And their very existence complicated the racial hierarchy she'd been taught. Where did these men fit in the natural order that placed Japanese at the top? On the American side of the camp, Marcus sat with several other soldiers in their tent, playing cards by lantern light. "Those women can't stop staring at us," Private Cooper remarked, laying down a card. "Makes me feel like some kind of zoo exhibit." "Can you blame them?" Duke replied. "Japan's about the most homogeneous country on Earth. Most of them have probably never seen a black man before." Still, Cooper persisted, the way they look at us, it's like they're trying to figure out what we are. Marcus remained silent, contemplating his cards. He was used to being stared at. It happened whenever black soldiers entered white towns back home. But this felt different somehow. The Japanese women's stares held fear and curiosity, but not the hostility he'd grown accustomed to in America. You know what's funny? Duke continued, the way they snap to attention whenever a white officer walks by. They've got the same color hierarchy we do back home. Not exactly the same, Marcus finally spoke. They were taught to hate all Americans, not just the white ones. They're just confused because they didn't know we existed. Lieutenant Jackson ducked into the tent and the men started to rise. As you were, he said, waving them back down. Sergeant Washington, a word outside. Marcus followed the lieutenant out into the humid night air. Sir? HQ wants more intelligence from the prisoners, Jackson said without preamble, specifically about medical facilities and personnel deployments in the areas they served. Marcus frowned slightly. With respect, sir, haven't they been debriefed already? Yes, but there are inconsistencies in their accounts. The brass thinks they're still holding back information that could be useful as we prepare for the mainland invasion. And you want me to work with Sergeant Yamamoto. Use your limited Japanese, the fact that they're curious about you. See if you can get them to open up more. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Sir, I'm not trained in interrogation. This isn't interrogation, Sergeant, just conversation. The war's all but over. The Japanese government is discussing surrender terms. These women know it. They might be more willing to talk now, especially to someone different. Marcus understood the implication. Use their curiosity about his race to extract information. The irony wasn't lost on him. Back home, his color was a liability. Here, it was suddenly a potential asset. I'll do my best, sir, he said finally. Good man. Start tomorrow. Focus on the leader, Lieutenant Nakamura. Intelligence says she was stationed at a major naval hospital before being transferred to Okinawa. She might have valuable information. As Jackson walked away, Marcus stood in the darkness, conflicted. He'd joined the army to fight fascism, to prove that African Americans deserved equal citizenship. Now he was being asked to exploit his race to manipulate prisoners, women no less. But orders were orders, and if the information could save American lives in a mainland invasion, didn't he have a duty to try? The next morning brought a thunderstorm that kept the prisoners confined to their barracks. By afternoon, the rain had stopped, but the ground was too muddy for gardening. Instead, the women were permitted to sit in the small yard outside their quarters, mending clothes and conversing quietly. Marcus approached with Sergeant Yamamoto, carrying a crate of oranges. Special ration, Yamamoto explained to the women in Japanese, then switched to English for Marcus's benefit. Fruit supplement for the prisoners, Colonel's orders. The women looked at the oranges with poorly concealed desire. Fresh fruit had become a rarity in Japan as the war progressed and shipping became impossible. Akiko stepped forward. Thank you, she said in English, her tone formal. We appreciate the consideration. Marcus set down the crate and stepped back, noticing how the women waited for Akiko's nod before each taking a fruit. I'll handle distribution, Sergeant Washington, Yamamoto said loudly, then added quietly, try to engage them while I'm here to translate properly. Marcus nodded and remained nearby as the women peeled their oranges with careful precision, saving even the peels. Is fruit scarce in Japan now? He asked conversationally. After Yamamoto translated, several women looked down, but Akiko answered evenly. Many things are scarce in wartime. I'm sure Americans have their own shortages. We do, Marcus acknowledged. Rubber, gasoline, certain foods. When this was translated, he noticed a flicker of surprise cross several faces. So you thought we didn't have rationing? He asked. Akiko hesitated before responding. We were told that Americans lived in luxury while our people sacrificed. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Every country tells its people something similar, I suppose. As Yamamoto translated this, Marcus noted the reactions. The younger women looked confused, while the older ones, including Akiko, remained impassive. May I ask a question? The youngest woman, Sadako, suddenly spoke up in halting English. Sadako, Akiko warned, but the girl continued. Why are you black soldiers? Separated from others? Yamamoto looked uncomfortable, but translated the question accurately. Marcus considered how to answer. The U.S. military is segregated. Black soldiers serve in separate units from white soldiers. After the translation, the women exchanged glances. Sadako persisted. But why? It was a question so fundamental, yet so rarely asked directly in America. Marcus chose his words carefully. That's just how it is in America. Separate units, separate facilities. Like Japanese and Koreans? An older woman, Yuki, asked unexpectedly. Marcus looked at her with new interest, perhaps similar in some ways, though the history is different. Akiko watched this exchange with growing concern. The conversation was veering into dangerous territory, making connections between their societies, humanizing the enemy. We should not discuss politics, she interjected firmly. It is not appropriate. Marcus nodded respectfully. Of course, Lieutenant, my apologies. Her eyes widened slightly at his use of her rank. You know who I am? Lieutenant Akiko Nakamura, Imperial Japanese Navy Nursing Corps, he confirmed. We have your service records. This wasn't entirely true. Marcus had only seen a basic prisoner roster, but the implied knowledge might encourage cooperation. Akiko's expression betrayed nothing, but Marcus sensed her recalculating. She'd assumed the black soldiers were low-ranking guards with no access to information about the prisoners. You speak some Japanese, she said. Not a question, but an observation. Very little, Marcus admitted. Ki o tsukete, arigatu, ohayo gozaimasu. Just basics. Why learn our language? She asked directly. It was a loaded question, and Marcus knew it. Behind the simple inquiry lay deeper implications about respect, power, and how enemies viewed each other. Knowledge is valuable, he replied simply. Understanding others makes us better, even if we're on opposite sides. After Yamamoto translated, a silence fell over the group. The women exchanged glances, something unspoken passing between them. Finally, Akiko nodded slightly. Thank you for the fruit, sergeants, she said, signaling an end to the conversation. As Marcus and Yamamoto walked away, the interpreter gave him an appraising look. Not bad, Washington. You got them talking about things they usually avoid. Did I learn anything useful for intelligence purposes? Marcus asked, keeping his voice neutral. Yamamoto shrugged. Not specifically, but you cracked the ice. That's something. They're curious about racial segregation, Marcus noted. Aren't we all? Yamamoto replied dryly. The irony isn't lost on me either, you know. My parents are in an internment camp in California while I'm guarding Japanese prisoners. This war makes strange symmetries. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Lieutenant Nakamura, she's sharp. Former head nurse at Sasebo Naval Hospital. Highly trained, highly disciplined. She's the one most likely to have useful information and the least likely to share it. What happens to them after the war? Marcus asked. Will they be held as war criminals? Medical personnel, not likely. Once the surrender is finalized, they'll probably be repatriated fairly quickly, unless, Yamamoto added grimly, they were involved in some of the medical experimentation we've discovered in other areas. Marcus frowned. Were they? No evidence so far. They seem to be legitimate medical staff, just doing their jobs in a war zone. Later that evening, Marcus was writing a letter to his wife, Josephine, when Lieutenant Jackson summoned him. Progress report, Sergeant. Some engagement, sir, but no substantial intelligence yet. They're curious about us. Black soldiers, I mean, but very disciplined about not discussing military matters. Jackson nodded. Keep at it. Colonel Hampton was impressed with your approach. Less confrontational than previous attempts. Sir, I'm not sure how much useful intelligence they actually have. They're nurses, not combatants. Medical personnel observe things, Sergeant. Troop movements, supply situations, command structures. Even if they don't realize what they know, they might have valuable information. Jackson paused. Besides, there's another angle we're interested in. Sir? Psychological assessment. How are the Japanese likely to react to surrender and occupation? These women represent educated Japanese citizens. Their attitudes could help us prepare for the challenges of occupying the home islands. Marcus understood. His assignment wasn't just about extracting specific military information. It was about gauging how the Japanese people might respond to defeat. "I'll continue the approach, sir." "Good. And Washington?" The colonel mentioned possible commendation if this works out. Might help your prospects after the war. The implication was clear. Success here could advance his military career, perhaps opening doors that would otherwise remain closed to a black soldier. "Thank you, sir," Marcus replied, though the offer left him with mixed feelings. In the women's barracks that night, a similar conversation was taking place. "They're trying to get information," Akiko warned the others. "The black sergeant is more approachable, so they're using him to make us lower our guard." "But the war is practically over," Fumiko pointed out. "What information could possibly matter now?" "Our duty doesn't change just because the tide of battle has turned," Akiko insisted. "We are still bound by our oaths to the Emperor." "Did you notice how the black sergeant answered Sadako's question about segregation?" Yuki interjected. "Very matter of fact. No bitterness." "What does that matter?" Akiko asked. "It's interesting," Yuki persisted. "We were told that America's diverse population was a weakness, that different races could never truly unite, yet they fight together against us." "In separate units," Akiko pointed out. "That hardly suggests unity." "Still," Nurse Hana Kobayashi spoke up, "they treat us better than we were told to expect. The rations are adequate. We haven't been harmed." The last word carried heavy implication. Akiko frowned. "Perhaps because we're women." "Perhaps," Yuki agreed. "But perhaps also because what we were told about Americans isn't entirely true." A murmur ran through the group. Akiko realized she was losing control of the narrative, something she couldn't afford if they were to maintain discipline and honor. "Listen to me," she said firmly. "The Americans want us to believe they are civilized to make us compliant. Whatever their true nature, our duty remains the same. We reveal nothing beyond what they already know." The women nodded, but Akiko sensed their resolve weakening. The reality of their treatment as prisoners stood in stark contrast to the horrors they'd been prepared for, creating cognitive dissonance that undermined years of indoctrination. And the black soldiers, their very existence complicated everything the women had been taught about racial hierarchy, about America, about the enemy. That night, Akiko lay awake, troubled by her own doubts. If imperial propaganda had been wrong about how prisoners would be treated, what else might it have been wrong about? The thought bordered on treasonous, yet she couldn't dismiss it entirely. The next morning brought news that electrified the camp. Emperor Hirohito had broadcast a message to the Japanese people, announcing acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration and Japan's surrender. The war was officially over. Among the Japanese women, reactions ranged from disbelief to quiet tears. For many, it was the first confirmation that their nation had truly been defeated. "It cannot be true," Sadako insisted, her voice breaking. "The Emperor would never surrender." "He acted to save the Japanese people," Yuki said quietly. "If the Emperor has decided this is the best path, we must accept it." Akiko maintained her composure, though inside she felt hollow. Everything she had worked for, everything she had believed in, reduced to defeat and occupation. The American officers gathered the prisoners to formally announce the surrender and explain what would happen next. "You will be repatriated to Japan as soon as transportation can be arranged," Major Williams informed them through Sergeant Yamamoto's translation. "Until then, your status remains unchanged. You are still prisoners, but with the war's end, certain restrictions will be eased." As the women absorbed this news, Marcus noticed the range of emotions on their faces. Relief, disbelief, grief, fear for what awaited them in a defeated Japan. But mostly, he saw uncertainty, the disorientation of people whose entire worldview had been upended. After the announcement, as the women returned to their barracks, Marcus found himself near Lieutenant Nakamura. "Are you all right, Lieutenant?" he asked quietly. She looked at him with red-rimmed eyes, her composure finally cracking. "How can we be all right? My country is defeated. Our cities are destroyed. The Emperor has been humbled. What future remains for Japan? Her raw honesty caught Marcus off guard. For weeks she had maintained perfect discipline. Now, in the moment of official defeat, her guard had dropped. Nations rebuild, he offered, even after devastating wars. She studied him for a moment. Why would you care about Japan's future? We are your enemies. Were, Marcus corrected gently. The war is over, and enemies in war don't have to remain enemies in peace. Akiko's gaze intensified. You believe that? After all that has happened? Marcus considered his answer carefully. I have to believe that. Otherwise, what's the point of surviving the war at all? Something in his words seemed to reach her. She nodded slightly, then continued toward the barracks, her back straight once more, her momentary vulnerability concealed. Over the next days, the atmosphere in the camp shifted. With Japan's surrender official, the strict military discipline on both sides began to relax slightly. The women were permitted more freedom of movement within the camp, additional personal items, and even some Japanese language books and magazines that had been confiscated earlier. Marcus continued his conversations with the prisoners, though now without the pretense of intelligence gathering. Instead, under the guise of preparing them for repatriation, he and Sergeant Yamamoto conducted informal education sessions about what they might expect when returning to Japan under occupation. During one such session, as Marcus explained the basics of democratic governance that would be instituted in post-war Japan, he noticed Akiko watching him intently. You speak of democracy with conviction, she observed when he paused, yet your own country denies you full citizenship because of your color. The bluntness of her statement created an awkward silence. Even Yamamoto looked uncomfortable translating it. America is imperfect, Marcus acknowledged, but its founding principles are sound even when the practice falls short. And you fight for a country that segregates you. That doesn't seem logical. It was a question Marcus had wrestled with since enlisting, one that many black soldiers struggled to answer. I fight for what America could be, not just what it is, he said finally. Each generation brings us closer to those founding ideals. The Double V campaign, victory over fascism abroad and racism at home. Akiko's expression showed she understood more than he expected. We were told that racial divisions would prevent America from fighting effectively, that diverse populations could never truly unify. They were wrong, Marcus replied simply. Unity doesn't require uniformity. As Yamamoto translated this, Marcus noticed several women nodding slightly, considering his words. What will happen to Japan now? Sadako asked, her English improving daily. Will Americans destroy our culture? Marcus shook his head. That's not the goal. Reform, yes. Demilitarization, yes. But not destruction of your cultural identity. How can you know this? Akiko challenged. You are not among those making such decisions. Because I've seen the plans, Marcus answered truthfully. General MacArthur's headquarters has drafted occupation policies. The emperor will remain as a symbolic figure. Japan will be helped to rebuild, not crushed further. This information visibly relieved several women, though Akiko remained skeptical. And what of those who fought against you? Will there be mass executions as we were told to expect? War criminals will be tried, Marcus confirmed, but not ordinary soldiers and certainly not medical personnel like yourselves. Akiko studied him intently. You speak with such certainty, as if you actually care what happens to defeated Japan. I do care, Marcus replied, because lasting peace depends on reconciliation, not retribution. In the days that followed, Marcus noticed a subtle change in how the Japanese women interacted with the black soldiers. The initial shock and staring had given way to something approaching normal human interaction. They still maintained appropriate distance, but the extreme discomfort had faded. One afternoon, as Marcus supervised a work detail in the camp garden, he found Yuki working nearby, carefully tending tomato plants. You have skill with plants, he observed. She nodded, not looking up. I grew vegetables before the war. It centers the mind. My grandmother was the same way. Could grow anything in the poorest soil. Yuki glanced at him, curious. Where was this? Alabama, southern United States. Was it very difficult, being black in the American South? Marcus hadn't expected such a direct question. Yes, he answered honestly, but people find ways to survive, to maintain dignity even in difficult circumstances. Yuki nodded slowly. Like the Burakumin in Japan, an outcast group, considered unclean for generations because of their occupations. Officially, discrimination ended in 1871, but in reality, she trailed off. Marcus was intrigued. I didn't know Japan had such distinctions. Every society creates hierarchies, Yuki said simply. Different rules, same human pattern. Their conversation was interrupted by shouts from across the compound. A group of newly arrived white soldiers, part of a replacement unit, had approached the fence separating the main camp area from the Japanese women's section. "Hey, look what we got here," one called out. "Jap women haven't seen a female in months." Marcus immediately moved toward the disturbance, gesturing for Yuki to return to the barracks. By the time he reached the fence, Lieutenant Jackson had already intercepted the newcomers. "This is a restricted area, soldiers. Return to your assigned sector immediately." The men grumbled but obeyed, casting lingering glances at the Japanese women, who had quickly moved away from the fence line. Jackson turned to Marcus. "Get the prisoners inside, Sergeant." "Yes, sir." As Marcus guided the women back to their barracks, he noticed Akiko watching the retreating white soldiers with a tense expression. "Those men," she said quietly, "they are what we were warned about." Marcus couldn't deny it. "There are good and bad individuals in every army, Lieutenant. But your unit, the black soldiers, none of you have behaved that way toward us." It wasn't a question, but Marcus answered anyway. "We have our orders, and beyond that, many of us know what it means to be treated as less than human. It's not something we wish to inflict on others." Akiko absorbed this, then nodded once before entering the barracks. That evening, Lieutenant Jackson called Marcus to his office. "There's been a change of plans, Sergeant. Headquarters is accelerating the repatriation schedule. The women prisoners will be transferred to a central processing center in 3 days, then shipped back to Japan by month's end." "So soon, sir?" "Orders from the top. They want to demonstrate goodwill by returning non-combatant prisoners quickly. It's politics." Jackson studied Marcus for a moment. "You've done good work here, Washington. Colonel Hampton noticed. He's put you in for commendation." "Thank you, sir." "You should know we've received intelligence reports from the processing centers. Many Japanese civilians and military personnel are committing suicide rather than face American occupation. They still believe we plan to slaughter or enslave them." Marcus frowned. "The propaganda runs deep." "Exactly, which makes what you've accomplished here potentially valuable beyond this small camp. These women have seen that Americans, even black Americans, who they never expected to encounter, aren't the monsters they were told to fear. When they return to Japan, they'll carry that knowledge with them." It was a perspective Marcus hadn't fully considered, that their interactions might have implications beyond the immediate intelligence value. "I understand, sir." "Good. Prepare the prisoners for transfer. Make sure they understand what to expect in the processing center and during repatriation." The next morning, Marcus and Sergeant Yamamoto gathered the women to explain the accelerated timeline. "You'll be transferred to a larger facility near Naha," Yamamoto translated. "From there, ships will take you back to mainland Japan, probably to Sasebo or Yokosuka port." The news was met with mixed reactions: relief at returning home, anxiety about what they would find there, uncertainty about the future under occupation. "Will we be safe at this processing center?" Akiko asked directly. "There will be many more American soldiers there." Marcus understood her concern after the incident with the replacement troops. "The processing center is well organized and strictly supervised. You'll be treated with the same respect you've received here." He saw doubt in her eyes but couldn't blame her. Trust built over weeks could be shattered in an instant, and she had responsibility for the other women. "The black soldiers?" Sadako asked hesitantly. "Will they come too?" Yamamoto translated, though Marcus had understood her broken English. "No," he replied. "Our unit remains assigned to this camp. Different personnel will oversee the processing center." He noticed several women exchange glances at this news. Their expressions suggested that the prospect of being handed over to unknown guards, likely white Americans, who matched the description in their propaganda, was unsettling. "But the procedures will be the same," Marcus assured them, "and the war is over now. Everyone wants a smooth transition to peace." As the women dispersed to prepare for transfer, Akiko remained behind. "Sergeant Washington," she said formally, "may I speak with you privately?" Marcus looked to Yamamoto, who nodded and stepped away, giving them space but remaining within sight as regulations required. "How can I help, Lieutenant?" Marcus asked. Akiko seemed to struggle with what she wanted to say. Finally, she spoke with careful precision. "I wish to thank you and your men for your correctness during our time here." Marcus understood what the formal words concealed: acknowledgement that the black soldiers had defied Japanese expectations of American brutality. "We were just doing our duty, Lieutenant." "Perhaps, but duty can be performed in many ways." She hesitated, then continued. "Before we were captured, we were instructed to take our own lives rather than become prisoners. We were told terrible things about how Americans would treat captives, especially women." Marcus nodded gravely, aware of the mass suicides that had occurred on Okinawa among civilians. "When your unit took over the camp, we were confused. You did not match what we had been told to expect from Americans. It made us question other things we had been taught." It was as close as she would come to admitting that imperial propaganda had been wrong, that her worldview had been shaken. "War depends on dehumanizing the enemy," Marcus said quietly. "All sides do it." "Yes." She met his eyes directly. "But sometimes we are forced to see the humanity we tried to deny." With that, she bowed slightly, the first time any of the Japanese prisoners had shown this traditional sign of respect to an American, and walked away. On the day of transfer, the women gathered their few possessions and assembled in the yard. They wore the same uniforms they'd had since capture, now cleaned and mended as best they could manage. Marcus and his squad stood at attention as Major Williams addressed the prisoners one last time. "You will be transported safely to the Central Processing Facility and then repatriated to Japan," the Major stated as Yamamoto translated. "When you return to your homeland, remember that America seeks a lasting peace between our nations. Cooperate with occupation authorities and help build a new Japan that can take its place among peaceful nations." The formal speech complete, the women were loaded onto transport trucks. As the last group prepared to board, Sadako suddenly broke protocol and approached Marcus. "Sergeant Washington," she said in her improving English, "will we see men like you in Japan during occupation?" The question caught him off guard. "Some. Perhaps. There are black soldiers in many units." She nodded, seeming relieved. "Good. The stories were wrong about you. Perhaps other stories are wrong too." Before he could respond, she rejoined the others and climbed aboard the truck. As the convoy prepared to depart, Marcus noticed Akiko watching him from the back of the last vehicle. Their eyes met across the compound, and she inclined her head slightly, a gesture of respect between equals. Lieutenant Jackson joined Marcus as they watched the trucks pull away. "Mission accomplished, Sergeant. You handled this assignment exceptionally well." "Thank you, sir. I hope they'll be all right." Jackson glanced at him curiously. "You actually care what happens to them, don't you?" Marcus considered the question. "I suppose I do, sir. They're just people caught in the same war as us. Different side, different culture, but people all the same." "A philosopher as well as a soldier," Jackson remarked, not unkindly. "Well, time to focus on our next assignment. We ship out for mainland Japan in 2 weeks, occupation duty." "Japan, sir?" Marcus hadn't expected this development. "Occupation forces need engineers. Roads, bridges, infrastructure all need rebuilding. And after your success here, headquarters thinks units like ours might be particularly effective in certain contexts." "I don't understand, sir," Jackson explained. "The Japanese have been fed propaganda about white Americans for years, but they have no preconceptions about Negro soldiers. Might make for smoother interactions in some situations. Call it a psychological experiment." The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. The same racial difference that limited his opportunities in America was now viewed as potentially valuable in occupied Japan. The military that segregated its own forces was now theorizing that black soldiers might help break down Japanese resistance to occupation. "I see, sir." 2 months later, Sergeant Marcus Washington stood on a Tokyo street, supervising a construction crew rebuilding a damaged bridge. His unit had been in Japan for 6 weeks, part of the massive American occupation force reshaping the defeated nation. The winter air was crisp and his breath formed clouds as he checked the engineering specifications. Around him, Japanese laborers worked diligently under American direction, the initial awkwardness of occupation gradually giving way to a tentative working relationship. He'd noticed it from the beginning, the different way the Japanese civilians reacted to black soldiers compared to white troops. There was still wariness, still the unavoidable tension of occupied and occupier. But the fear was tempered with curiosity, even occasional moments of connection that transcended the circumstances. Headquarters had noticed too, after several reports of smoother interactions between black units and local populations, certain areas of responsibility were being quietly assigned with racial dynamics in mind, a strange reversal of the segregation policies that remained firmly in place within the military itself. As Marcus checked measurements on a support column, he became aware of someone watching him. Looking up, he was startled to see a familiar face, Lieutenant Akiko Nakamura, now in civilian clothes, standing at the perimeter of the construction zone. He approached her, surprised but pleased. "Lieutenant Nakamura, this is unexpected." She offered a small bow. "No longer lieutenant," she corrected. "Just Nakamura-san now. The Imperial Navy has been disbanded." "Of course. Are you well? How was your repatriation?" "Difficult," she admitted. "Tokyo is—" She gestured at the partially rebuilt cityscape around them. "Not as I remembered it. But we survive. I work at a civilian hospital now, treating those injured in the bombings." Marcus nodded, understanding the massive adjustments Japanese society was undergoing. "And the others? From the camp?" "Most returned to their homes, those that still exist. Sadako is also in Tokyo, training at the hospital. Yuki returned to her village in the north." She hesitated. "Some found their families had not survived the war." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of all that had been lost settling between them. "I did not expect to see black soldiers in the occupation force," Akiko finally said. "After our transfer from your camp, we saw only white Americans. We've been here 6 weeks, Marcus explained. Engineering battalion, rebuilding infrastructure." Akiko nodded, watching the Japanese laborers working alongside the American soldiers. "They are adjusting to you faster than they did to the white soldiers. I've observed this. Headquarters has noticed the same thing." "It's because you were never in our propaganda," Akiko said simply. "We were taught to fear and hate white Americans for years, but black Americans, you were unknown to us, a blank page." The observation was astute and matched what military psychologists had begun to theorize. The Japanese had no pre-existing framework for interactions with black Americans, no years of cultivated hatred to overcome. "I came to thank you," Akiko continued unexpectedly. "What I learned at your camp, it helped me adapt to this new reality, to understand that what we were taught about Americans wasn't entirely true." "I'm glad," Marcus said sincerely. "It wasn't an easy realization, I imagine." "No," she agreed, "to question what you've always believed. It's painful, but necessary." From across the construction site, Lieutenant Jackson called for Marcus. "A duty calls," he said apologetically. Akiko nodded in understanding. "Of course." She reached into her bag and withdrew a small package wrapped in paper. "For you, a small gift of thanks." Marcus accepted it hesitantly. "That's not necessary. In Japan, expressions of gratitude are important," she insisted, "and please—" He nodded his thanks, tucking the package into his pocket as they exchanged formal goodbyes. Later that evening, in the privacy of his quarters, Marcus unwrapped the gift. Inside was a small, beautifully crafted wooden statue of Jizo, a Buddhist deity he recognized from his limited study of Japanese culture, protector of children, travelers, and those in transition between worlds. With it was a note in careful English, to remind you that even enemies can recognize each other's humanity. With respect, A.N. Marcus placed the statue carefully on his footlocker, a tangible reminder of unexpected connections formed across the divisions of race, nationality, and war. In April 1946, as cherry blossoms transformed Tokyo's war-scarred landscape, Marcus received orders to return to the United States. His unit's deployment was ending, part of the gradual reduction in occupation forces as Japan stabilized under MacArthur's administration. On his final day in Tokyo, he took a walk through a park where Japanese families cautiously coexisted with off-duty American soldiers. Children flew kites in the spring breeze, their laughter a reminder of life continuing despite the upheavals of history. He spotted Akiko sitting on a bench, reading a medical journal. In the months since their unexpected reunion, they had established a cautious professional relationship. She occasionally served as a liaison between the hospital where she worked and American medical units, and they had spoken several times in official capacities. "Nakamura-san," he greeted her. Using the honorific he'd learned was appropriate. She looked up, offering a small smile. "Sergeant Washington, I heard your unit is leaving soon." "Tomorrow," he confirmed, sitting beside her when she gestured to the empty space. "Back to America." "And what awaits you there?" she asked. "After serving your country so faithfully?" The question carried weight beyond its simple phrasing. They both knew that the America Marcus was returning to remained deeply segregated, that his service overseas would not erase the color barriers at home. "I'll return to teaching," he said, "mathematics at a Negro college in Detroit, and continue working for change." She nodded thoughtfully. "Japan is changing too, sometimes willingly, sometimes not, but changing nonetheless. For the better, I hope." "I believe so," she said, surprising him with her certainty. "The militarism, the extreme nationalism, they led us to destruction. Whatever replaces them must be better." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching the children play. "Our encounter at the camp," Akiko said finally, "it was significant in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. Seeing Americans who didn't match our propaganda, it created a crack in everything I had been taught, and through that crack other questions entered." Marcus understood. Small revelations can lead to larger ones. Yes, and now Japan must rebuild not just its cities, but its understanding of itself and its place in the world. She turned to face him directly. "Your presence here, Black Americans among the occupation forces, has made that rebuilding somewhat easier, I think. You were never the demons in our stories." "Just men," Marcus said simply, "like any others." "Not quite like any others," Akiko corrected with a small smile. "Men who showed respect to enemy prisoners when they could have shown contempt, who spoke a few words of Japanese when they could have demanded we speak only English, small things that made a large difference." A cherry blossom drifted down, landing on the bench between them, a symbol of beauty and impermanence in Japanese culture. "I've been asked to help develop a new nursing curriculum," Akiko continued, "one that incorporates both Japanese traditions and Western medical advances. A synthesis rather than a replacement." "That sounds promising." "It is, and I find myself thinking of our conversations at the camp, about how unity doesn't require uniformity." She smiled slightly. "Your words which I've borrowed." "They're yours now," Marcus replied, pleased that something from their unlikely connection had proved valuable. They exchanged a few more minutes of conversation before Marcus rose to leave, aware of the many tasks awaiting him before departure. "Goodbye, Nakamura-san. I wish you well in your work and Japan's reconstruction." She stood as well, bowing formally. "Goodbye, Sergeant Washington. I hope America soon recognizes the full measure of its citizens, regardless of color." As they parted ways, a Black American soldier and a Japanese former naval officer, enemies turned reluctant colleagues in the aftermath of global war, Marcus reflected on the strange pathways history sometimes took. The segregated unit assignment that had seemed like another instance of racial limitation had unexpectedly created an opportunity for human connection across profound divides. The Japanese women's shocked stares at seeing black soldiers had evolved into recognition of shared humanity, challenging propaganda on both sides. And perhaps most importantly, the experience had reinforced his belief that change was possible, slowly, painfully, incompletely, but possible nonetheless. In Japan, in America, in the human capacity to move beyond hatred and fear toward something better. As Marcus walked back toward base for the last time, cherry blossoms drifting around him in the gentle spring breeze, he carried that belief with him, a hard-won optimism that would sustain him through the struggles for equality that still lay ahead in his own country. 73 years later, in 2019, an elderly Japanese woman named Sadako Ito sat in her Tokyo apartment with her great-granddaughter, looking through a box of photographs and mementos from her long life. "And this," she said, carefully lifting a faded photograph, "was taken just after the war, at the hospital where I completed my training." Her great-granddaughter, a university student studying international relations, examined the image of young nurses in white uniforms standing in front of a partially rebuilt hospital. "You never talk much about the war, Oba-san," she observed. "Was it too painful?" Sadako considered the question. Parts were painful, yes, but there were also revelations, things I learned that changed how I saw the world. "What kind of things?" The elderly woman's eyes grew distant with memory. "We were taught that Americans were demons, barbaric, cruel, inhuman. But as a prisoner, I discovered they were just people, different from us, but people nonetheless." She carefully extracted another photograph, this one showing a group of black American soldiers standing at attention beside a camp perimeter. These men especially, black Americans, we had never seen such men before. We couldn't stop staring at first, it was so shocking to us. But they treated us with dignity, when they had every reason not to. Her great-granddaughter studied the image with interest. "We learned about segregation in American history class. These soldiers would have faced discrimination in their own country." "Yes," Sadako nodded. "That was the most powerful revelation, that men who were not treated as equals in their own nation could still show respect to enemy prisoners. It made me question everything I had been taught about hierarchy, about who deserves dignity." She carefully returned the photographs to their box. One soldier in particular, Sergeant Washington, he spoke a few words of Japanese. Such a small thing, but it mattered greatly. It suggested that our culture, our language, had value even to those who had defeated us. "Did you ever see him again, after the camp?" "Once, briefly, in Tokyo during the occupation. He was helping rebuild a bridge." Sadako smiled at the memory. "Lieutenant Nakamura, our senior officer at the camp, she saw him more often. They developed a professional respect, I think." Her great-granddaughter leaned forward, genuinely interested. "Do you think those interactions between Japanese civilians and black American soldiers made a difference in the occupation?" Sadako nodded slowly. "I believe they did. The occupation could have been much harsher, much more humiliating for Japan. But there were moments of unexpected understanding that eased the transition, small human connections that tempered the larger political forces at work." She closed the box of memories, her hands spotted with age but still graceful. History books record the big events, battles won and lost, treaties signed, governments formed and dissolved. But the true change often happens in smaller moments, when people see beyond the categories they've constructed to the humanity underneath. Outside her window, modern Tokyo sparkled in the evening light, a thriving metropolis rebuilt from the ashes of war, now a close ally of its former enemy. The journey from bitter conflict to partnership had been long and complex, shaped by geopolitics and economic necessity. But as Sadako knew, it had also been shaped by countless small moments of human recognition across seemingly insurmountable divides. Moments like those in a prisoner camp on Okinawa, when Japanese women couldn't stop staring at black American soldiers, and in that startled curiosity began to question the foundations of hatred they had been taught. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.